3 decades, more than 30 years existing in a sport that was not born to be for him, and everything that once amazed the world is now gradually becoming an image that is hard to look at for long. There is a rare type of athlete who does not just compete to win. He makes people believe that you do not need to be perfect to become great, that you can break every rule, live by instinct, and still make the whole world watch. That strength does not only lie in technique, but in daring to be yourself to the very end. John Daly is exactly that kind of person, living proof that a man without discipline, without control, without fitting any mold can still step onto the most prestigious golf courses and make every eye stop. Not because of perfection, but because of truth. But what happens when the man who never tried to become a role model starts appearing before our eyes in a way that no one can ignore? How does a person who once lived by instinct, who once hit farther than anyone, who once turned chaos into victory, now walk slower on his own field, with a heavy body, a cigarette that never leaves his hand, and a pace of life that seems to be slowing with every step? What is really happening inside a life that from the outside always looks like it does not need fixing? The years of alcohol, gambling, broken marriages, and loss of control have left what that we are only beginning to see now. And why is the hardest thing for people to accept not the mistakes of the past, but the fact that he still continues as if he has never changed, still appears, still plays, still exists, as if nothing has ever been enough to make him stop? Before answering all of that, we need to go back to the beginning, not to a famous golf course, but to a childhood without clear structure, where a boy did not learn how to control, but learned how to live by instinct, and from there created a man that the world could never fully understand, but also could not turn away from. If this story makes you stop and think, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next haunting parts behind the life of John Daly. John Daly's childhood was not tied to one fixed place. There was no home he could call an anchor, but rather moves back and forth, cities passing by as if they had never existed long enough to become memories. When a child does not have enough time to put down roots, he does not learn how to belong. He learns how to adapt. And over time, that adaptation no longer becomes a choice, but turns into instinct. Daly grew up in a family that did not lack affection in the way outsiders could see, but lacked something more important: a clear framework, a strong enough boundary to keep a child in place when he started to slide too far. There were no rules maintained for long, no stability enough to create a feeling of safety, and, when there are no limits, a child will find his own limits, often by going farther than necessary, trying more than is safe, and gradually getting used to not fearing consequences. That was not deliberate rebellion. It was a lack of direction repeated for so long that it became the only way of living he knew. And then a quiet feeling began to form, not loud, not clear, but always present. The feeling of not really belonging anywhere, not attached long enough to anyone to have to change for them, no strong enough reason to stop before things went too far. In a world like that, golf did not appear as a carefully chosen path. It appeared as an escape, not because Daly loved the rules of the sport, but because it was the only place he could pour all his energy into without having to explain, without having to ask permission, without having to follow any mold. A club, a ball, and the wide open space ahead. That was not discipline, that was freedom. And for a child who had never been taught how to control himself, freedom was not a reward. It was everything. Daly did not learn golf the way others learned. He did not build it step by step, did not train in a tight system, was not molded to become an ideal model. He hit the ball the way he felt was right, the way his body reacted, the way instinct guided him. And that very thing created something both astonishing and worrying, because talent can develop in freedom. But if there is no discipline to go with it, it will never learn how to stop. And that was exactly what began very early in his life. No one taught him how to control. No one forced him to slow down. No one was really there long enough to keep him within a safe limit. And when a person grows up without knowing limits, they do not only become strong in their own way, they also become fragile in a way they themselves do not realize. Daly's first swings were not just technique. They were the expression of a man unbound, a man who had never been taught to fear anything, and therefore had never learned how to protect himself from what would come later. And perhaps right from those years, when there was no fame yet, no money, no mistakes big enough for the world to see, everything had already started. A life not built on a stable foundation, but on voids, constant movement, and a kind of freedom that in the end would become the most expensive price he had to pay. And then, from that very void, something began to form. Not in the way it was taught, but in the most natural way possible. John Daly did not learn golf like others. There were no coaches following every step, no formal training programs, no carefully calculated practice sessions to optimize every movement. What he had was only a club, a ball, and a very personal feeling about how his body worked. While other golfers were taught to control every smallest detail, from swing angle to breathing rhythm, Daly did the opposite. He did not control. He let go. And it was precisely in that letting go that a rare talent began to show itself. Not perfect, not stable, but powerful enough that it could not be ignored. His shots were unlike anyone else's, not neat, not standard, not following what the books taught. But the ball flew farther, faster, and carried an energy that people could not explain by technique alone. That was not just power. That was pure instinct. And instinct, when uncontrolled, can become the most frightening thing, not only for opponents, but for the one who possesses it. People around him began to notice that. They saw potential, but they also saw instability. They saw a talent that could change an entire match with one swing, but could also ruin everything with the very next shot. Daly was not the type of athlete you could build according to a plan. He did not respond to discipline the way the system expected. What he did best was exactly what the system could not control, and that was a paradox no one around him could solve. In the early years, this showed clearly through his competition results. There were days he played like someone unbeatable, where every shot was right, every decision seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought. But there were also days when everything collapsed so fast that no one could understand what had just happened. No stability, no clear growth curve, only sudden peaks and unexpected drops. And that was exactly what made Daly a phenomenon that people were both drawn to and worried about. Because when talent does not come with discipline, it is not only unpredictable, it is not sustainable. But amid all that instability, one thing began to make his name spread. The long drives, not just a little farther, but so far that it changed the way people thought about the limits of the sport. While other golfers calculated every yard, Daly simply swung the club, and the ball flew as if it obeyed no limits. That distance was not just a number, it was a statement, an affirmation that he did not play by the same rules as the rest of the world. And from then on, the nickname began to appear. Long John, not because he was perfect, not because he was stable, but because he had something no one else could replicate. But that very thing also began to create another gap, not between him and his opponents, but between him and control. When you can always solve problems with power, you never learn how to handle it when power is no longer enough. When you get used to breaking limits, you do not realize that one day you yourself will need limits, so you do not break yourself. And perhaps, right in those free swings, right in the moments when the whole world started to pay attention, something else was also quietly forming. Not maturity, but a path with no clear stopping point, where talent continued to develop, but the ability to control himself did not keep up. And when those two things drifted apart, The result was not greatness. It was a life always in a state of imbalance, a life where every step forward carried the risk of a bigger fall ahead. And then, all those seemingly scattered things suddenly converged into a moment no one could predict, a moment unprepared, not arranged, and not meant for him from the beginning. John Daly did not step into the 1991 PGA Championship as a contender, nor as a name people were waiting for. He came there almost by chance, a last-minute alternate spot that in any normal circumstance would only mean filling a gap, a presence that most people would not notice. There was no perfect preparation process, no strategic calculation, no pressure to prove anything. And it was precisely the absence of all the things others considered necessary that created a rare state, an absolute freedom, where he entered the tournament carrying no burden other than his own instinct, while others carried expectations, carried pressure, carried even the fear of failure. Daly stepped onto the course with a mindset that was almost empty, not because he had overcome everything, but because he had never really placed himself inside those frameworks. And when you have nothing to lose, you also have no reason to be afraid. The first shots were not a big statement, but simply the continuation of the way he had always played, powerful, direct, without hesitation. But very quickly, everything began to change. The ball did not just fly far, it flew accurately. The decisions were not just bold, they were effective. And as each round passed, the name that no one had noticed at first began to appear in positions that should not have belonged to him. Surprise gradually turned into attention, then into astonishment. People started looking closer, started wondering what was happening, how someone unprepared, not in any plan, could stand there competing with the biggest names in the sport. But for Daly, everything still kept its original nature. He did not change the way he played to fit the stage. He brought his true self onto that stage. And when you bring something completely real into an environment used to standards, it will either be eliminated or break everything. And in that week, Daly did the second. Victory did not come like a climax built slowly, but like an explosion no one was ready for. When he stood there with the trophy in his hand, the golf world did not just witness a new champion. They witnessed something they did not know how to explain. A person who did not follow the familiar path, did not obey the rules, was not shaped by the system, but still surpassed them all. It was not just a victory, it was an interruption. A reminder that what is considered standard is not always the only path, and in just a few days everything changed. From an unknown name, Daly became a phenomenon. His image appeared everywhere. His story was told like a miracle, a proof that anyone could step up and win if they had enough talent and opportunity. But right in that moment, something else also existed, less talked about, less seen, because this victory was not built on a solid foundation. It did not come after many years of control, did not come from a system that had been tested and perfected. It came from instinct, from freedom, from a state without pressure that no one could maintain forever. When you win in that way, you do not only receive glory, you also face a question that is not easy to answer. How to repeat this when the world starts to expect, when pressure starts to appear, when you are no longer an outsider, and that was exactly what Daly never really had the chance to learn. He did not have time to rebuild himself before the lights shone directly on him. There was no buffer between unknown and famous, no transition period to adapt to becoming the center of attention. One day you are someone no one knows, the next day you are a major champion. And the gap between those two states was too big, too sudden, leaving no room for preparation. In the eyes of the world, it was a fairy tale. In reality, it was a leap with no clear landing point. And when you fly up too fast, without knowing where you will come down, even victory carries its own special risk. A risk that only those inside it can feel, that everything has changed, but you yourself have not. And sometimes that very gap between who you are and who the world thinks you must become is where the things that will come later begin. And then, when the lights had not even had time to go out, when the cheers of victory were still echoing, something else began to creep into John Daly's life. Not loud like the moment of lifting the trophy, but quieter, more persistent, and ultimately more decisive than any shot he had ever taken. Success did not come to him step by step, did not give him time to adapt, to understand, to rebuild himself according to a new image. It crashed in, complete, sudden, and too big for a man who had never been prepared to become the center of the world. One day, he was an outsider stepping into the tournament that no one noticed. The next day, he was a major champion, the name everyone wanted to meet, wanted to take pictures with, wanted to hear stories from. And the gap between those two things was not just fame. It was a complete change in the way the world looked at him, and more importantly, the way he began to look at himself. But one thing did not change, and that was the fact that he was still the same man, with the same instinct, the same way of living, the same lack of discipline that had followed him from his early years. There was no strong enough team to hold him back when everything started moving too fast. There was no guide to tell him that success is not only something you achieve, but something you have to learn how to keep. And when there was no one standing between him and everything the world had just given him, Daly did what he had always done. He lived by instinct. Money began to come, not little by little, but like a flow with no clear stopping point. And for a person who had never been taught how to control, money was not a tool. It was an opportunity to expand the way of living he was used to. Expensive cars, parties that lasted until morning, new circles of friends appearing as quickly as they disappeared. All created a world where no limits were set, and there was no reason to stop. Alcohol did not come as a problem right from the beginning. It came as part of the fun, as something that came with success, with release, with the feeling of belonging to something bigger. But over time, the line between use and dependence began to blur. The nights became longer, the mornings became harder, and gradually, alcohol was no longer a choice but became a habit. Meanwhile, the luxurious lifestyle continued to expand, not because he needed it, but because he had never learned how to say no to it. When you step into a world where everything is available and no one tells you there are things you should not touch, you will touch everything. And Daly did exactly that, not because he wanted to destroy everything, but because he had never been taught how to preserve. In the eyes of outsiders, this was the image of a man enjoying success, a man living the life many people dream of. But beneath that surface, something else was forming, slowly but surely. When the lifestyle began to exceed the ability to control, when decisions were no longer based on thought but only on emotion, when each passing day felt like a continuation of the previous one with no stopping point, then the risk was no longer a distant possibility. It became a direction. And the most telling thing was that throughout that period, Daly did not realize what was happening. Not because he was not smart enough, but because he had never lived in a way that forced him to stop and look back. When everything was still happening, when the lights were still shining, when people were still calling your name, it was very hard to believe that something was wrong. And that was exactly what made this period more dangerous than any failure. Because failure, at least, gives you a clear signal. Here, everything still looked like success, while the foundation underneath began to crack. And those cracks, though small, though no one had seen them yet, had already begun right at the moment that should have been the highest point in his life. And then, from those seemingly harmless parties, something began to change in a way that at first no one really noticed, not even John Daly himself. Alcohol was no longer just part of the fun. It became part of the day. No special occasion needed, no clear reason, simply because it was there. And he had gotten used to not saying no to what was in front of him. The long nights began to spill into the mornings. The competition days no longer started with preparation, but with trying to recover from the night before. And over time, the line between competing and existing in a not fully sober state began to blur. This did not happen immediately. It happened little by little, slowly enough that he did not feel the need to change, but steadily enough to create a trajectory that, once entered, was very hard to escape. The tournaments that had once been the place where he showed his strongest instinct now began to become the place where his limits showed more clearly than ever. There were rounds where he still played well, still created moments that reminded people of the man he once was. But between those moments were shots lacking control, hasty decisions, mistakes that could not be explained by competition pressure alone, and gradually a different image began to form. Not the surprise champion from back then, but a man fighting not only against the golf course, but against himself. The times he withdrew from tournaments began to appear, not because of clear injuries, not because of objective conditions, but because he could not continue. There were days he left the course midway, leaving behind not only an unfinished round, but questions no one could answer for him. Penalties, disciplinary actions began to come, not as isolated events, but as repeating signs of a problem that was becoming clearer. The experts began to criticize, not because they did not see his talent, but because they no longer saw the control necessary for that talent to exist at the highest level. And in a sport where stability is considered everything, lack of control is not just a weakness. It is a risk the system cannot accept. Performance declined gradually, not in a clear straight line, but in stages, in series of tournaments. In moments when people began to realize that what he had once been able to do no longer appeared with the same frequency. There were days he still made the crowd stand up, still created shots that only he could make. But those days became rarer, and the gaps between them grew larger. Meanwhile, what happened off the golf course began to affect directly what happened on the course. When you cannot control your own life, you cannot expect to control a match. When your body is not properly rested, when your mind is not in a clear state, every decision becomes heavier, every mistake harder to fix. And for Daly, this was not just theory. It was reality playing out in front of everyone. Not being able to control personal behavior did not stop at what he drank or how he lived. It began to show in the way he reacted to pressure, the way he handled failure, the way he faced his own limits. There were times he appeared defiant, as if he did not care what others thought. There were times he was silent, as if he no longer had the energy to react. And between those two states, there was no clear point of balance. His career, which had been built on unstable foundations, now began to suffer clear impacts. Opportunities no longer came as easily as before. Invitations decreased. Expectations, once very high, now began to be replaced by doubt. Not because he had lost talent, but because he was no longer someone who could guarantee that talent would show up when needed. And in the professional world, where everything is measured by consistency, that was a problem no one could ignore. But perhaps the most telling thing was not that his career began to be affected, but the way it was affected. Not by one big collapse, not by one single moment when everything ended, but a chain of small, repeated changes, little by little, to the point that when looking back, people could not point out exactly when everything started to go wrong. And for Daly, that meant there was no clear moment to stop, to change, to start over. Only a path that was gradually veering off, and a man who continued to walk on that path as if nothing was big enough to make him turn back. And when what happened on the course began to lose control, what happened off the course also could no longer maintain the stability a person needs to hold on to. John Daly's personal life did not develop in a straight line, did not go from building to lasting, but was like the way he played, exploding quickly, intensely, then cracking before it could stabilize. The marriages came fast, with the same familiar feeling that this time everything would be different, that this time he would find an anchor he had never had. But the very way he lived, The very lack of control that had taken root long before made it impossible for things to stay as they were in the beginning. Relationships, which need time and patience to grow, were pulled into the same fast rhythm of life, where emotions changed suddenly, where what was built today could collapse after just one night. Conflict did not appear immediately. It accumulated from small differences, from unmet expectations, from one person unable to change while the other could no longer continue to accept. And when conflict began, it did not stop at words. It escalated in a life that had already lacked control from before, when pressure, alcohol, and personal instability all existed together. The line between argument and violence became thinner than ever. There were times when what happened behind closed doors could no longer be completely hidden. Incidents that caused injury, times when police had to intervene, stories that began to appear in the media, all created an image no one had ever thought would be associated with a major champion. One of the most shocking moments came when he was attacked in his own relationship, an incident that not only left physical wounds, but also exposed the reality that what was happening had gone beyond what could be controlled. And when a relationship reached that point, there were not many choices left. Divorce became the inevitable outcome, but even the ending did not happen in silence. The breakups dragged on, tense, full of arguments, not just between two people, but in front of the public, where every detail was scrutinized, where every story was retold in a way that made everything heavier. For Daly, that was not just losing a relationship. It was losing yet another chance to have the stability he had never really had. And this did not happen once. It repeated. The following marriages followed a similar trajectory, starting with hope, ending in conflict, and leaving behind voids that were not easy to fill. Family, which for many should be a place to return to, gradually became another part of the chaos he was living in. There was no structure solid enough to hold everything together. There was no stable rhythm of life for relationships to last. And when that stretched over many years, over many tries and failures, it began to create a feeling that perhaps this was no longer the problem of each individual relationship, but a part of the man he had never changed. In the eyes of outsiders, these stories could be seen as scandals, personal mistakes, things a famous person has to face. But when looking deeper, it was not just scattered events. It was a connected chain, where each breakdown was not only the result of circumstances, but also the continuation of a way of living that had existed for a very long time. And what made it tragic was not that those relationships ended, but that even after going through all of it, even after seeing the consequences clearly, he still could not create a big enough change to stop that cycle from continuing. Family, for many, is a place of healing. For Daly, it became a place of reflection, where the things inside him that had not been resolved appeared more clearly than anywhere else. At each time a relationship ended, it did not just close a chapter, it left a mark, added another layer to a life that already had few anchors, and made the road ahead more unpredictable. Not because of a lack of opportunities, but because of a lack of something he had never really had, stability enough to keep what was important. And then, when what had once been called anchors in life could no longer hold their original shape, when family was no longer a place to return to, another void began to open, deeper, harder to fill, and more dangerous than anything that had come before. For John Daly, that void was not filled with silence or reflection. It was filled with speed, with sensation, with things that could make him forget everything for a short time. And that was when gambling stepped into his life, not as a harmless pastime, but as the next part of the same trajectory that had begun long ago, where everything was pushed to the extreme. Casinos were not like the golf course. There were no cheering crowds, no titles to lift, no history to record. Only the tables, the numbers, and the feeling you get when everything is bet on a single moment. And for a man who had grown used to living in moments like that, where victory could come unexpectedly and failure could come just as fast, Gambling was not a foreign world. It was a natural continuation. The initial amounts were not small, but they were also not something that made people stop. For Daly, money had never been something to hold on to. It was something to use, to push into experiences, to turn into stronger sensations. And when you start betting with large amounts of money, not because you need to, but because you can, you also begin to step into a cycle that very few people can escape. The night stretched on, with no clear distinction between day and night, between winning and losing. There were times he won big, the numbers rising so fast that everything seemed easy, as if he had found another way to win, without needing the golf course, without needing practice, just sitting down and playing. But gambling does not work that way. What it gives you, it will also take back, and usually more. And for Daly, what was taken away was not small amounts. It was millions of dollars, accumulated over many years, over many nights, over many decisions made in moments when emotion overpowered reason. He once admitted that he had lost tens of millions of US dollars gambling, a number that for many people is unimaginable. But for him, it did not come from a single time. It came from repetition, from not stopping when he needed to stop, from continuing even when he could clearly see the consequences. The nights stretched for hours, where time seemed to lose meaning, where each hand was not just a game, but an opportunity to change the feeling, to forget what was happening outside. And in those moments, winning or losing was no longer the most important thing. The important thing was to keep going. But it was precisely that not stopping that made everything serious. When you do not stop after losing, you do not just lose money. You lose the ability to control. And when that happens, the next decisions are no longer based on logic, but on hope, on emotion, on a belief that everything can be taken back with just one more time. And that one more time is never the last. Finances began to be affected in a clearer way. Not immediately, not with one big collapse, but piece by piece, amount by amount, accumulated loss. What he earned from golf, from fame, from all the years before, began to disappear, not because he no longer had the ability to make money, but because he could not keep what he had. And the most telling thing was that even when it became clear, even when the numbers could no longer be ignored, the cycle continued. Not because he did not know, but because he did not stop. And that was exactly the point where gambling became part of a bigger story. Not an isolated mistake, but another expression of the same thing that had always existed in his life, the absence of limits. When there are no limits, no stopping point, no moment when you tell yourself that is enough, everything will continue to go farther than you think is possible. And for Daly, that did not happen once. It repeated in different ways, in different stages, but always with the same result. The loss did not stop at money. It expanded to other parts of life. Missed opportunities, things that could not be taken back, and a feeling that became clearer and clearer that even though he was still moving, still living, still appearing, there were things that had passed with no way to go back. And in all of that, the hardest thing for people to understand was not how much he had lost, but the fact that he still continued, without stopping, without turning back, as if that very cycle had become an inseparable part of who he was. A part that no matter how many consequences it brought, he still could not, or did not want to, leave. And then, when looking back at everything that had happened, what makes John Daly's story different does not lie in one single moment, does not lie in one clear collapse that people can point to and say everything started from there. There was no fateful night when everything ended. There was no single wrong decision that changed his entire life. Instead, it was a chain of slips, of getting back up, then slipping again, repeating over many years, to the point that the line between failure and continuing to exist became blurred. There were periods when he seemed to have come back, not in a perfect way, but enough to make people believe that this time it might be different. Tournaments where he played better, moments when the swing still held the power and freedom that once amazed the whole world, appearances where his name was mentioned again with a bit of hope, but then, right after, everything slipped out of his hands in the familiar way. A tournament abandoned midway, a week of unstable play, a series of results that made people realize that comeback had never really been sustainable. And this did not happen once, it happened many times, in cycles with no clear ending point. Each time he stood back up carried hope. Each time he fell made that hope more fragile. But none of them were big enough to make him stop completely. And perhaps that was exactly what was hardest to understand. While many people, when facing such a chain of failures, would choose to leave, choose to change, choose to rebuild from the beginning, Daly did not do that. He did not radically change his lifestyle. There was no clear turning point where he decided that from now on everything would be different. The old habits were still there. The old cycles still continued. And amid all of that, he still kept competing. Not because he was always at his highest level, not because he always had a chance to win, but because he had never left the golf course. No matter what the results were, no matter what his body was like, no matter how chaotic life outside was, he still showed up, still held the club, still stepped onto the course as if that was the only thing that did not change in a life that was always in motion. And that very presence created a paradox, a person who could not control many things in his life, yet maintained a continuity that not everyone has. Not stability in performance, but stability in not quitting. There were days he played like a memory of himself, where what once made his name only appeared in short moments. But there were also days, though rare, when he still showed that the talent had never completely disappeared. And that was exactly what made people keep following, keep waiting, keep hoping that maybe, just one more time, he would find what he once had. But each time that hope came, it was accompanied by a reality that could not be ignored, that the cycle had not stopped yet. There was no change big enough to break it. There was no clear ending point, only continuation. And in that continuation, time kept passing. The body kept changing. Opportunities gradually became fewer. But Daly was still there, as if continuing itself, no matter the circumstances, had become a part of who he was. Not victory, not a perfect comeback, but not quitting. And sometimes, in a story like this, that becomes the most noteworthy thing. And when a person continues to exist in a way unlike anyone else, sooner or later, they will collide with the very system they stand in. For John Daly, that collision did not come from one single action, but from the man himself, from the way he appeared, the way he played, the way he lived, all of which did not fit what traditional golf had built over many decades. This is a sport shaped by control, by discipline, by the image of athletes who always maintain calmness, standards, and consistency both on and off the course. But Daly was never that kind of person. He did not try to become a model, did not adjust himself to fit the expectations around him, and that was exactly what made him an exception. The system did not know how to handle. In the eyes of the administrators, the people who built the image of this sport, he was not just a different individual, he was a problem. Not because he lacked talent, but because that talent came with a lifestyle they could not control, could not predict, and also could not easily accept. Behaviors off the course, appearances with images that did not match the standards, unexpected decisions in competition, all made him a figure. The PGA could not fit into any ready-made framework. And when a system built to operate on consistency encounters an uncontrollable element, its natural reaction is to create distance. Penalties, reminders, rules applied, not always to remove him, but clearly to limit his influence within a range they felt acceptable. The experts, people used to judging everything based on clear standards, did not stand aside either. Criticism was not only aimed at competition results, but at his entire approach to his career. They saw a talent wasted, an opportunity not utilized, a man who could have achieved more if only he changed a few basic things. And in that view, Daly became an example, not of success, but of what can happen when talent does not come with discipline. But the story did not stop there, because while the system tried to adjust him, while the experts continued to criticize, there was another group that saw him in a completely different way. The fans, those who did not come to golf only for perfection, but also for emotion, for what was most real, for the unpredictable moments. For them, Daly was not a problem. He was a reason to keep following, a man unlike anyone else, who did not hide his true self, did not try to become an accepted version, but simply existed in the way he had always existed. They saw in him not only the mistakes, but the authenticity, not only the failures, but the fact that he still kept showing up after everything. And that created a special relationship, where support did not come from perfection, but from the fact that he had never pretended to be anything else. In a sports world that is increasingly controlled, where images are carefully built, where every action is considered, Daly became something rare, not a model, but a different symbol, a reminder that not every path is the same, that there are people who never fit the system, but still leave a mark in a way the system itself cannot create. And perhaps that very lack of fit, that always standing outside what is considered standard, is what makes him impossible to forget. And then, when the collisions with the system gradually became a familiar part, something else began to appear. No longer the arguments, no longer the image or fame, but John Daly's own body, something he had almost never had to think about before. For many years, he had lived as if his body was a tool without limits, something that could endure everything without having to pay the price right away. But over time, that price began to show, not loudly but clearly, sign by sign. The diabetes diagnosis came as a warning that could not be ignored, not an injury that could recover after a few weeks, but a condition that would stay, that would go with him in every next step. And from that point, everything began to change, not in a sudden way, but in a way that made people realize what had once been considered normal was no longer the same. His health declined, not only in subjective feeling, but in the way he moved, the way he played, the way he reacted to what had once been very familiar. The rounds became heavier. The swings no longer held the stability they once had, not because he forgot how to hit, but because the body no longer responded the way it once did. And then there were moments no one could ignore, the times he fainted during competition, the seconds when everything stopped, not because of the result, but because he could not continue. That was no longer a story about form, but a story about limits. A limit that for many years he had lived as if it did not exist. Physical condition, which had once allowed him to hit balls farther than others, was no longer a clear advantage. It became something he had to manage, had to face, had to accept that it was no longer at the level it once was. But what made the story complicated was not that the body changed, but the way he reacted to that change. Because even though there were clear signs, even though there were warnings no one could deny, he still continued to compete, still showed up on the course, still held the club, still walked, even though each step was no longer as light as before. Not because he did not know what was happening, but because stopping had never been part of the way he lived. And along with that, the old habits did not disappear completely. Alcohol still appeared in his life, even if perhaps less, even if it was controlled more at some points, but it never disappeared completely. Cigarettes were still there, as a familiar part of the image people had seen for many years. And it was precisely that parallel between the body weakening and the habits not changing radically that created an indescribable feeling. Not surprise, but a prolonged worry. People saw what was happening, saw the signs, but also saw that the man still continued, still did not stop, still lived in the way he had always lived, and in a way that both made people admire and made them feel heartache. Because there is a difference between fighting and continuing without changing. And for Daly, the line between those two things was not always clear. There were days he still showed that he could still do it, that the talent had not completely disappeared, that even if the body changed, the spirit was still there. But there were also days when the fatigue was clear. No need to explain, no need to analyze, just looking was enough to understand that time had begun to leave a mark that could not be erased. And in all of that, he was still there. Not as a perfect version of his past self, but as a man carrying everything he had been through, both good and bad, both glory and consequences. And perhaps that very presence in such circumstances is what makes this story hard to look at. Not because it is unexpected, but because it is too real. And then, when the warning signs could no longer be ignored, when the body had forced him to stop multiple times even though he did not want to, something even more serious appeared, not like a sudden event, but like a clear reminder that everything had reached a limit that could no longer be taken lightly. John Daly was diagnosed with bladder cancer, a phrase that even without fully understanding it was enough to make anyone stop. No longer fatigue, no longer dizzy spells, no longer problems that could be temporarily overcome. This was something else, something tied to existence itself, to the time left, to things that were no longer within the control of will or habit. He had to undergo surgery, a process that not only demanded physical strength, but also forced him to face a reality that perhaps before he had never truly accepted, that this body was not something that could endure infinitely. The days in the hospital, the moments when he was not on the golf course, not in the middle of the crowd, with no noise from the world around, created a rare silence, where there was nothing to hide, where everything had to be looked at directly. And in that silence, perhaps for the first time, the limits became clearer than ever. Not a distant concept, but a reality. The risk of recurrence was not something that could be ignored after the surgery ended. It was there, like a possibility that always existed, like something he had to carry with him in every next decision. And for a man who had grown used to living without thinking too much about long-term consequences, that created a certain change, not by turning him into a completely different person, but in the way he began to perceive more clearly what he was facing. But awareness does not mean radical change. And that was exactly what made this story more complicated. Because even though he had gone through such an event, even though he had seen more clearly what could happen if everything continued in the old direction, he still did not stop completely. The habits, even if they might have decreased, even if they might have been adjusted at some points, had not disappeared. Cigarettes still appeared. The lifestyle still carried familiar elements, not because he did not know, but because changing completely had never been something he did. And amid all of that, he still returned to the golf course, not as a man who had fully recovered, not as a story of a strong comeback, but as a continuation of something that had never stopped. He still showed up, still competed, still walked on the fairways he had walked hundreds of times before. But now every step carried a different meaning. No longer about proving he was better than others. No longer about conquering another title. But about continuing. Even in circumstances where many people might have chosen to stop, and that created a feeling that was very hard to name. Not completely hope, because the reality was still there with all the risks and limits. Not completely despair, because he still continued, still appeared, still did not disappear. But something in between, where each time he appeared carried both things at once. People saw a man who had been through too much, a man whose body had begun to react to everything he had done over many years. But they also saw something else, a resilience not built on discipline, not shaped by plans, but existing as a part of who he was. Something that made him not stop, even when there were enough reasons to do so. And perhaps it was in this period that the question was no longer whether he could go back to the way he was before, but how far he would continue to go and in what way, while carrying everything that had happened, not only in his career, but in his own body. And then, amid everything that had happened, amid the marks that time had left on John Daly's body and life, something began to appear with a different meaning. Not loud, not showy, but enough to keep this story from sinking completely into the losses. That was the relationship with his son, John Daly II, a part of life that in many years before had not always been placed at the center. When a father spends most of his time on his career, on personal whirlwinds, on an unstable life, family relationships often become the first to be affected. And for Daly, that was no exception. His past had not only left marks on himself, but had also spread to those around him, including his son, who had grown up in an environment that was not entirely stable, where the image of a father who was both famous and chaotic, both close and distant, existed side by side. But over time, something began to change. Not in a perfect way, not like a clear transformation, but like a quiet effort, step by step, to do what perhaps before he had not done enough. The times when father and son appeared together on the golf course were not just a nice sports image. They carried more than that. When they competed together, when they walked on the same fairway, when people saw them standing next to each other, something was expressed without words, that a connection was being rebuilt, not from the beginning, but from what remained after everything. John Daly II was not simply the son of a legend. He began to follow his own path in golf, with a style that might be influenced but not completely like his father. And in that process, Daly was not just a father standing outside watching. He became a part of that journey, not in a perfect role, but with everything he had been through. The moments they competed together were not always about victory, not always smooth, but they created something else. A feeling that amid all the chaos, there was still something being held on to, or at least being tried to be held on to. However, the past does not disappear just because the present changes. What had happened in many years before was still there, not always clearly present, but always existing in the way things unfolded. A relationship cannot be completely rebuilt in just a few moments, no matter how meaningful those moments are. The distances that once existed cannot be erased immediately, and perhaps that was exactly what made this story more real. Not a perfect repair journey, but a process that was still happening, with all the difficulties, the limits, and the things that could not yet be changed. Daly did not become an ideal father according to ordinary standards. He did not erase his own past, but he showed up. He was there. He shared moments that before might have been missed, and in a way, that was a form of effort that is not always clearly recognized. When people look at the image of father and son on the golf course, they may see a story of continuation, of a new generation stepping up. But if they look deeper, they also see another story, about a man trying to hold on to a part of his life, not by changing completely, but by being present more in places where before he had not been enough. And it is precisely in that presence, even if imperfect, even if incomplete, that there is something worth noticing. Not because it erases everything that had happened, but because it shows that even in a life full of cycles, full of mistakes, there are still moments when a person tries to go in a different direction. Even if only a little, even if it is not enough to change the whole story. And perhaps for Daly, that is not a new ending, but an opportunity that is not complete but still exists. And then, when looking at the present, when everything that had happened is no longer stories in the past, but becomes existing marks on every step, the image of John Daly no longer resembles anything the world was once familiar with. He still appears on the golf course, still holds the club, still walks among the fairways that had once witnessed his greatest moments, but everything is now different. The body no longer reacts as before. The movements become heavy, slow, no longer the agility of an athlete who once amazed the whole world. There are times when just looking at the way he moves, people can feel that each step is no longer simple, that the body is having to work harder just to maintain things that before were natural. And amid all those changes, there are things that still do not disappear. The cigarette is still there, as familiar as his own image over many years. The old habits have not completely left him, even though there have been enough reasons to do so. Not because he does not know what they bring, but because they have become a part of who he is, a part that even when facing clear limits, he is still not ready to let go of completely, and it is precisely that parallel that creates a very special feeling. When people see a man whose body is weakening, but whose way of living has never really changed, he is no longer at the peak of his form, no longer the one who can step into a tournament with a clear expectation of winning, no longer the name that makes opponents wary in the old way. The shots are still there, sometimes still bringing moments that remind people of the past, but they no longer appear with enough frequency to create a comeback. And more importantly, this is not a story about a strong comeback. There is no complete recovery journey, no clear transformation to bring him back to his old position. What is happening is not a comeback in the ordinary sense. It is a continuation, a man who still shows up, still competes, not because he is on the way back to the peak, but because he has never really left. And that is exactly what makes this image so hard to describe. People do not see a champion trying to regain the spotlight. They see a man carrying everything he has been through, from glory to consequences, from strength to limits, and still continuing to step onto the course as if that is the only thing he knows how to do. Those who follow him do not just come to watch a match. They come to see a story that is still unfolding, a story whose ending is not clear, where each appearance carries a different feeling. There are times of admiration when he can still create moments that not everyone can do. But there are also times of heartache, when what appears before the eyes is no longer the image of a man at his peak, but a man facing limits he cannot avoid. And perhaps it is precisely the combination of those two things that makes people unable to turn away. Because while one part of them wants to hold on to the image of him in the past, another part realizes that what is happening now is also an inseparable part of the story. Not a perfect version, not a rewritten ending, but reality, with everything it carries, and in that reality, Daly is still there. Not like before, but still enough to make people stop, look, and wonder how far a man can go when he has never really stopped, even when everything around him has changed. And then, when everything that had happened was placed next to each other, not as scattered pieces but as one continuous flow, John Daly's story cannot be understood in the way people usually understand a legend. This is not a life built with discipline, not a journey controlled step by step, not a path where every mistake is fixed to lead to a perfect image at the end. On the contrary, this is a life lacking control from the very beginning, where choices were not always carefully considered, where habits were not always changed, and where consequences, even when they appeared clearly, were still not enough to create a complete change of direction. Money came, and then it went, not because he lacked the ability to create it, but because he did not keep it. Family formed, and then it broke apart, not because he did not want an anchor, but because he had no way to keep everything stable long enough. Health was once something he did not need to think about, then became a problem he could not ignore, and now is a reality he has to carry with every step. If looked at in the ordinary way, this is a chain of losses, a list of things he could not hold on to, proof of how far a man can go without a foundation to keep himself in place. And if it stopped there, this story could end as a warning, as an example of what can happen when talent does not come with discipline. But what keeps this story from stopping there is something else, something that does not fit into any evaluation system, something that cannot be measured by titles or numbers. He still exists, not in a perfect way, not in the way people expect, but he is still there, in the world of golf, in the memories of those who once followed him, in the moments that, though brief, are still enough to remind people that the man has never completely disappeared. And perhaps it is precisely that existence after everything that has happened that makes people unable to forget him. Not because he was the best, not because he was the most stable, but because he is one of the very few people who never tried to become anything other than himself, no matter what the price. In a world where images are usually built carefully, where every action is considered, Daly stands as an opposite. Not perfect, not controlled, but real. And that very truth, even if not always easy to look at, is what gives his story its own weight. A man who stumbled, not just once, but many times, in different ways, at different stages, and each time carried a part of life that could not be taken back. But he did not stop. There was no moment when he decided that everything was over. There was no point where he completely left the path he had been on. He continued, not because everything had been fixed, but because continuing seemed to be the only thing he knew how to do. And in a way, that creates a different kind of legacy. Not titles recorded in history, but an image that people remember. A man who, even if he may not be a role model, still leaves an irreplaceable impression. Not perfection that makes people remember, but authenticity. Not that he avoided mistakes, but that he lived with them, carried them, and still kept going. And perhaps, when looking back at it all, the question is no longer how much he lost, or what he could have become if things had been different. But what made him, after all of it, still be there, not to prove anything, but simply to continue existing, in the only way he had ever known. The story of John Daly leaves a feeling that is very hard to name. Not just sadness, but a prolonged heartache when we witness a man who is both strong and fragile in a very real way. When looking back at the entire journey, from the boy who grew up in instability, without a clear framework, to the 1991 major champion who stepped into the tournament as an outsider and then amazed the whole world, and then the years submerged in alcohol, gambling, broken marriages, abandoned tournaments, criticism, and gradually losing control, we do not see a single collapse, but a chain of repeating cracks. The most painful thing is perhaps not that he lost tens of millions of dollars or faced bladder cancer, but that even when his body weakened, when he fainted on the course, when he had to undergo surgery, he still could not completely change the habits that had taken root deep inside him. But it is also right there that something worth treasuring appears. He still continues to step onto the course, still competes with his son, still shows up, even if he is no longer at his peak. For a society like the United States, where success is often tied to discipline and control, this story is a reminder that not everyone wins in a perfect way, and not all value lies in never making mistakes. Sometimes what makes a man remembered is not what he achieved, but the fact that he still stands there after everything he has lost. The lesson here is not to encourage letting go, but a clear warning. Talent without control will destroy itself, but at the same time it is also a tribute to endurance, to the ability to keep living and moving forward, even when life does not unfold the way people expect. If this story makes you think and feel a very real part of life, please hit subscribe to follow more journeys that are never perfect but always memorable. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore imperfect people who never disappear.